Sometimes, the most broken souls recognize each other across a crowded field. Sometimes, it takes losing everything to find what you were truly meant to discover. In Cedar Ridge, there was a black stallion that everyone had given up on. They called him Devil Shadow, and for 3 years, he stood alone in that corral, while folks whispered he was cursed. No cowboy could ride him. No trainer could break him. Then Thomas McKinnon arrived in town. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and gentle hands, carrying only an old saddle and memories he kept private. When he said he'd take the horse nobody wanted, the whole town came out to watch. They expected to see another man get hurt. They expected failure. What they witnessed instead changed everything they thought they knew about patience, kindness, and real strength. How did one soft-spoken stranger succeed where the toughest cowboys had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where wooden buildings stood like weathered sentinels against the Montana sky. This was a town carved from necessity and stubbornness, where men earned their respect with calloused hands and straight talk, and where a man's word was his bond, or he found himself unwelcome mighty quick. At the heart of town sat Morrison's livery stable, a sprawling structure of weathered timber and corrugated iron that housed the finest horses this side of the Continental Divide. Jake Morrison had built his reputation on breeding strong stock and training reliable mounts. But there was one animal in his care that had become both his pride and his greatest burden. Devil Shadow stood in the far corral, separated from the other horses by 40 feet of empty space that might as well have been an ocean. The stallion was magnificent in a way that made men stop and stare despite themselves. Coal-black from nose to tail, he stood 17 hands high with muscles that rippled like water beneath his glossy coat. His mane flowed like liquid obsidian, and his eyes held an intelligence that was both captivating and unsettling. But it was the bridle hanging on the fence post nearby that told the real story. Silver conkos caught the morning light, each one engraved with intricate patterns that spoke of craftsmanship and care. The leather was supple despite its age, darkened by years of use and bearing the subtle marks where a gentle hand had adjusted the fit countless times. This bridle had once belonged to a horse that knew trust, that had carried its rider with pride and affection. The transformation from beloved mount to untouchable beast was a tale whispered in the saloons when the whiskey loosened tongues. Devil's Shadow had belonged to Marcus Delaney, a rancher who treated his horses like family until drink and gambling debts drove him to desperate measures. The night before the bank took his land, Delaney had beaten the stallion with a whip until Jake Morrison and Sheriff Bill Crawford pulled him away. The horse had never forgotten. Sheriff Crawford remembered that night every time he walked past the corral. He was a man built like a oak tree, broad and solid, with gray threading through his brown hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard decisions. He'd seen men broken by circumstance before, but watching what happened to that beautiful horse had settled in his chest like a stone. 3 years, he muttered to Doc Henderson as they shared coffee on the porch of the medical office. 3 years that animal's been standing there, and not one man's been able to so much as get a lid rope on him. Doc Henderson was a thin, scholarly man who'd come west after the war to escape memories he couldn't heal in civilization. His hands were steady and gentle, whether he was setting bones or delivering babies. But he'd tried his luck with Devil Shadow once and still bore the scar on his forearm where the stallion's teeth had found their mark. "Can't say I blame him," Doc replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Some wounds go deeper than flesh. That horse learned that men mean pain, and no amount of sweet talking's going to convince him otherwise." Across the street, Martha Wade swept the boardwalk in front of her boarding house with the same methodical precision she brought to everything in her life. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun and green eyes that missed nothing. Her husband had died in a mining accident 5 years back, leaving her to run the boarding house alone, and she'd proven more capable than most men at keeping books balanced and rooms filled. She paused in her sweeping to watch Jake Morrison approach the Stallion's corral with a bucket of oats, the same ritual he performed every morning with the same disappointing result. Devil's Shadow would watch him approach until Jake was 10 feet away, then retreat to the far corner, powerful muscles coiled and ready to strike if the man came closer. "Morning, Jake," Martha called. "Any luck today?" Jake shook his head, setting the bucket down near the fence and backing away. He was a compact man with permanently stained hands and patience that had been worn thin by 3 years of failure. "Same as always. He'll eat when I'm gone, but won't let me within spitting distance." It was then that the stranger arrived. Thomas McKinnon rode into Cedar Ridge on a bay mare that had seen better days, leading a pack horse loaded with the kind of gear a man accumulated when he had no permanent address. He was perhaps 45 years old, with brown hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were clean but well worn, and he sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot. But it was his hands that people noticed first. They were large and gentle, moving with deliberate care, whether he was adjusting his reins or reaching for his hat. These were hands that had held precious things and lost them, hands that had learned the value of patience through sorrow. He pulled up in front of Morrison's livery and dismounted with quiet efficiency, his worn leather saddlebag settling across his shoulder with a soft thud. Those saddlebags had traveled many miles and held secrets he wasn't ready to share, letters that would never be answered. A daguerreotype that brought equal measures of comfort and pain, and mementos of a life that felt like someone else's memory. "Looking for a place to stable my horses?" Thomas said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who spent long hours alone. Jake sized him up with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with drifters, rustlers, and honest men in equal measure. Something in the stranger's bearing set him apart from the usual saddle tramps who wandered through town. There was discipline in the way he stood, respect in how he treated his animals, and a quality of stillness that spoke of hard-won wisdom, too. "$1 a day for both animals, feed included," Jake said. "If you're staying longer than a week, we can work out a monthly rate." Thomas nodded, reaching for his coin purse with movements that were economical and sure. As he counted out the money, his attention was drawn to the solitary figure in the far corral. Devil's Shadow stood perfectly still, but every line of his body spoke of coiled energy and suspicious alertness. "Magnificent animal," Thomas observed, his voice carrying a note that made Jake look at him more carefully. "Magnificent and worthless," Jake replied with bitter honesty. "Name's Devil's Shadow, and he's earned every syllable. Had him 3 years now, and he's put more men in Doc Henderson's office than I care to count." Thomas walked slowly toward the corral, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Devil's Shadow watched him approach, nostrils flaring as he tested the stranger's scent on the wind. When Thomas reached the fence, he stopped and simply stood there, making no attempt to reach through the rails or call to the horse. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked quietly. Jake found himself telling the story he'd repeated countless times, but something about the stranger's attention made it feel different, more important somehow. He described Marcus Delaney's fall from grace, the night of violence that had shattered the trust between man and horse, and the 3 years of failed attempts that had followed. "Every cowboy within 50 miles has tried his hand at breaking him," Jake concluded. "Brett Hawkins offered to buy him last month, said he'd show everyone how it's done proper. I told him the same thing I tell everyone, that horse will kill." the man who tries to force him. As if summoned by his name, Brett Hawkins chose that moment to swagger down the street, with two of his ranch hands flanking him like bodyguards. Brett was a big man who wore his arrogance like a badge, with blonde hair slicked back and clothes that cost more than most men earned in a month. He owned the largest ranch in the territory and never let anyone forget it. "Well, well," Brett called out, his voice carrying the particular brand of joviality that meant trouble. "Looks like we got ourselves another horse whisperer. You planning to try your luck with old Devil Shadow there, friend?" Thomas turned to face the newcomer, taking his measure with the same quiet assessment he'd given the stallion. There was something in Brett's eyes that reminded him of officers he'd known during the war, men who confused volume with authority and cruelty with strength. "Just getting acquainted," Thomas replied evenly. Brett laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Getting acquainted? Mister, that animal's beyond acquaintance. What he needs is a firm hand and a stout whip to remind him who's boss. I've been telling Jake here for months that I'd be happy to break that horse proper." The conversation had drawn a small crowd, as conversations in small towns tend to do. Martha Wade had abandoned her sweeping to drift closer, and Doc Henderson had emerged from his office with Sheriff Crawford right behind him. Even some of the local children had gathered, sensing drama in the air with the instinct of youth. Thomas continued to study Devil Shadow, who had moved closer to the fence despite the growing number of observers. The stallion's attention seemed fixed on the quiet stranger, as if he sensed something different about this man that set him apart from all the others who had come before. "Some things can't be broken," Thomas said finally, his words carrying a weight that made Brett's smile falter slightly. "Only healed." It was then that Devil Shadow did something that made the entire crowd fall silent. The stallion took 3 steps closer to the fence and lowered his great head, bringing his muzzle to within inches of Thomas's outstretched hand. For a moment that lasted an eternity, man and horse regarded each other with something that might have been recognition. Then the moment passed, and Devil Shadow retreated to his customary position, but the damage was done. Every person who witnessed that brief connection knew they had seen something extraordinary, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the untamable stallion. Red's face darkened with something that went beyond embarrassment to touch on genuine anger. "Lucky accident," he said loudly, though his voice carried a defensive edge. "That horse is dangerous, and anyone fool enough to trust him is asking for a shallow grave." Thomas turned to face Brett directly, and for just a moment, those winter blue eyes held something that made the rancher take an involuntary step backward. It was the look of a man who had seen too much and survived things that would have broken lesser souls. "I'll take him," Thomas said simply, addressing Jake Morrison but keeping his gaze fixed on Brett. "The stallion. I'll buy him from you." The silence that followed was complete. Even the children seemed to hold their breath as Jake Morrison struggled to find words for a situation he'd never imagined encountering. "Mister," Jake said finally, "that horse has never been ridden. Not once in 3 years. He's beautiful to look at, but he's not worth dying for." Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet that had seen better days. From it, he extracted a small roll of bills that represented most of his remaining money. "Name your price," he said quietly. "That horse and I have business to discuss." By sundown, word had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. The stranger had paid Jake Morrison $200 for Devils Shadow, more money than most folks saw in a year, and announced his intention to begin training the stallion the very next morning. The news divided the town into 2 camps: those who thought Thomas McKinnon was brave, and those who thought he was simply eager to meet his maker. Martha Wade found herself checking the window of her boarding house more often than usual, watching the livery stable where Thomas had taken a room in the loft above the horses. She'd offered him a proper room in her establishment, but he politely declined, saying he preferred to stay close to his animals. There was something about his quiet courtesy that reminded her of her late husband, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The morning arrived gray and cool, with autumn mist clinging to the valley floor like a living thing. Thomas rose before dawn, as was his habit, and spent long minutes sitting on the edge of his narrow cot, staring at a faded photograph he kept wrapped in oilcloth. The image showed a young woman with laughing eyes and a boy of perhaps 8 years, both frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Sarah and little James, his wife and son, taken from him in one terrible moment when their wagon had overturned crossing a rain-swollen creek 3 years ago. He'd been away on a surveying job, making the money they needed to buy their own land when it happened. By the time he'd returned, there had been nothing left but 2 wooden crosses and the crushing weight of guilt that followed him like a shadow. He wrapped the photograph carefully and returned it to his saddlebags, where it rested alongside letters he'd written but never sent, and a child's wooden horse that James had carved himself during the long winter evenings. These were the artifacts of a life interrupted, treasures that had become torments he couldn't bring himself to abandon. The sound of voices outside drew him to the window. Already a crowd was gathering in the street, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Thomas recognized the hunger in their faces, the same look people got when they passed a bad accident, wanting to look away but unable to resist the pull of potential disaster. Brett Hawkins stood at the center of the group, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I give him 10 minutes before that devil puts him in the dirt," he was saying to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, that stallion's going to kill somebody, and it might as well be a stranger as one of our own." Thomas dressed carefully in clothes that had seen better days but were clean and mended. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, as he prepared for what he knew would be the most important test of his life. Not because his reputation was at stake. He'd lost everything that mattered 3 years ago, but because something in Devil's Shadow's eyes had spoken to the broken places in his own soul. He descended to the stable floor, where Jake Morrison was already tending to the other horses with the nervous energy of a man trying to stay busy. Jake looked up as Thomas approached, his weathered face creased with worry. "You don't have to do this," Jake said quietly. "I'll buy him back from you for what you paid. No shame in changing your mind." Thomas shook his head, pulling on the worn leather gloves he'd carried since his cavalry days. "Some things can't be undone, Jake. Only move through." He walked to the tack room and selected not a saddle or bridle, but a simple lead rope made of soft cotton. The crowd outside had grown larger, and he could see faces pressed against the windows of the buildings facing the corral. Even Doc Henderson had emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, clearly expecting to have work before the morning was through. Devil's Shadow stood in the center of his enclosure, magnificent and alert. The stallion had clearly sensed the change in the air, the electric tension that comes before moments of truth. His nostrils flared as Thomas approached the gate, and every muscle in his powerful frame was coiled like a spring. Thomas opened the gate slowly, stepping into the corral with movements that were deliberate but non-threatening. The crowd fell silent, even the children sensing the gravity of what they were witnessing. This was not entertainment. This was a communion between 2 damaged souls, each carrying wounds that ran deeper than flesh. "Easy, boy," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying across the corral like a prayer. "I know what it's like to be afraid." Devil's Shadow backed away, but not with the panicked flight that had characterized his response to other men. Instead, he moved with cautious dignity, keeping his eyes fixed on the stranger who had dared to enter his domain. Thomas stopped in the center of the corral and simply stood there. He made no move toward the horse, offered no treats or bribes, made no attempt to corner or capture. Instead, He began to speak in low, measured tones about things that seemed to have nothing to do with horse training. He talked about loneliness, about the weight of carrying sorrow alone. He spoke of nights when sleep wouldn't come and days when the simplest tasks felt like climbing mountains. His words were not directed at the horse so much as into the space between them, creating a bridge of shared understanding that had nothing to do with dominance or submission. "I lost my family," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely carrying to the fence where the crowd strained to hear. "Lost them to my own pride and need to provide. Spent 3 years thinking I could run far enough to escape the guilt, but some things follow you no matter how many miles you put behind you." Devil Shadow's ears pricked forward, responding not to the words themselves, but to the tone, to the quality of pain that resonated in the stranger's voice like a tuning fork. Slowly, cautiously, the stallion took a step closer. "I see it in your eyes," Thomas continued, still making no move toward the horse. "That look of something beautiful that's been broken. The way you stand apart from the others, like trust is a luxury you can't afford anymore." Another step closer. The crowd had grown so quiet that the sound of the horse's hooves on the packed earth seemed loud as thunder. Martha Wade found herself holding her breath, one hand pressed to her throat as she watched something she'd never seen before unfold in that dusty corral. Thomas reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew something that made several people gasp. It was the photograph of his family, the one he'd been holding that morning. He looked at it for a long moment, then carefully placed it on the ground between himself and the stallion. "That's my Sarah and my boy James," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They were the best parts of me, and I let them down when they needed me most. But maybe that's not the end of the story. Maybe broken things can learn to trust again." Devil Shadow stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he investigated this strange offering. The photograph meant nothing to him but the vulnerability in the gesture. The willingness of this man to share his most precious possession spoke a language the horse understood. The stallion took another step, then another, until he stood just outside the reach of Thomas's outstretched hand. For a moment that seemed to last forever, man and horse regarded each other across a space that might have been inches or miles. Then Devil's Shadow did something that sent a collective gasp through the watching crowd. He lowered his great head and gently nuzzled the photograph with his velvet muzzle, as if blessing the memory of the family that had been lost. Thomas felt tears he hadn't shed in 3 years tracking down his weathered cheeks as he slowly, carefully, reached out to touch a stallion's neck. Devil Shadow flinched but didn't retreat, allowing the contact for a brief moment before stepping back. "That's enough for today," Thomas said softly, retrieving his photograph and backing slowly toward the gate. "Small steps, boy, small steps." The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and speculation about what they had witnessed. Some claimed it was just luck, that the horse would be back to his old ways by tomorrow. Others whispered that they had seen something approaching magic, a communication that transcended the normal boundaries between man and beast. Brett Hawkins pushed through the crowd, his face dark with an emotion that went beyond mere frustration. "Parlor tricks," he announced loudly. "Any fool can sweet-talk a horse for 5 minutes. Let's see him try to put a saddle on that devil." But Thomas had already left the corral, the lid rope still coiled in his hand. He'd made contact, not physical, but something deeper. He'd shown Devil Shadow that not all men came with pain, that sometimes the most broken souls could recognize and heal each other. As he climbed back to his loft room, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. It was fragile as morning frost and just as likely to disappear with the sunrise. But it was real. Tomorrow he would return to the corral, and the day after that, and the day after that, until either he or the horse learned to trust again. Outside his window, Devil Shadow stood at the fence, looking toward the building where the gentle stranger had gone. For the first time in 3 years, the stallion had allowed a human to touch him without fear or anger. It was a beginning, nothing more, but nothing less. The days that followed established a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Each morning before dawn, Thomas would descend from his loft and enter Devil Shadow's corral with nothing more than patience and soft words. The crowd that gathered to watch grew smaller as the spectacle of potential disaster gave way to the slower, more subtle drama of trust being rebuilt one careful moment at a time. On his belt, Thomas wore a pair of cavalry spurs that caught the morning light when he moved. They were polished to a mirror shine, but showed no signs of recent use. The rowels had been filed smooth years ago, rendering them decorative rather than functional. These spurs represented everything he had left behind: the harsh discipline of military life, the belief that strength meant dominance, the idea that broken things could only be fixed through force. He'd earned those spurs during the war, serving as a cavalry trainer at Fort Riley, where his gift with horses had made him invaluable to officers who needed reliable mounts quickly. But the methods he'd been taught, breaking a horse's spirit to make it compliant, had never sat well with him even then. Now, watching Devil Shadow respond to gentleness where force had failed, Thomas felt vindicated in his quiet rebellion against conventional wisdom. "Progress is slow," Jake Morrison observed on the fourth morning, leaning against the fence as Thomas stood in the center of the corral speaking softly to the stallion. "But it's progress all the same." The Devil Shadow now approached within 6 feet of Thomas during their sessions, close enough that the man could see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes. The horse no longer retreated when Thomas entered the corral, though he remained alert and ready to flee if threatened. It was a delicate dance of approach and retreat, trust offered and withdrawn. Two damaged souls learning to believe in the possibility of connection again. Martha Wade had taken to serving Thomas his breakfast on the front porch of her boarding house, where they could watch the early morning training sessions while sharing coffee and quiet conversation. She found herself looking forward to these peaceful moments before the town fully awakened, when the gentle stranger would tell her stories of his travels without ever quite revealing the deeper pain she sensed in him. "You have a way with horses," she said one morning, setting a plate of eggs and biscuits beside his chair. "Did you learn that in the Army?" Thomas nodded, his attention still focused on the corral, where Devil Shadow was investigating a small pile of oats he'd left near the fence. "Cavalry service teaches you to read horses quick, but the Army way isn't always the best way. Sometimes the gentlest approach is also the strongest." Martha settled into the chair beside him, noting how carefully he chose his words, as if each one had weight and consequence. She'd buried one husband already and had no interest in romantic complications. But there was something about Thomas's quiet strength that reminded her of what she'd lost and made her wonder if it might be possible to find again. "Jake says you paid good money for that horse," she said. "More than most men see in a year. Must be you've got some savings put by." Thomas was quiet for so long that Martha began to think he hadn't heard her, but finally he reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly when he set it on the table between them. The weight of it suggested more coins than she'd expected. "Separation pay from the Army," he said simply, "plus what I've saved from survey work these past few years. A man with no family doesn't have much need for spending money." The casual mention of family, or the lack thereof, hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Martha had lost her husband to a mining accident and knew the particular quality of silence that surrounded people who'd learned to live with absence. But something in Thomas's voice suggested a deeper wound, a loss that went beyond the natural order of things. Doc Henderson joined them as they watched Thomas's morning session with Devil Shadow, his medical bag never far from hand, despite the decreasing likelihood that it would be needed. The elderly physician had taken a professional interest in what he was witnessing, fascinated by the psychological elements of trust and healing that seem to apply as much to humans as to horses. "Remarkable progress," Doc observed, settling onto the porch steps with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the morning cold. "That animal's allowing sustained proximity now. Yesterday, I saw him actually extend his neck toward you." Thomas nodded, finishing his coffee with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned not to hurry life's important moments. He's curious now instead of afraid. Curiosity is the beginning of trust. "And what happens when Brett Hawkins decides he's tired of waiting for you to fail?" Doc asked quietly. "That man's pride has been stung, and wounded pride makes men do foolish things." As if summoned by his name, Brett appeared at the end of the street with two of his ranch hands, their boots raising small clouds of dust as they walked with the measured swagger of men who believed intimidation was a tool like any other. Brett had been conspicuously absent from the morning crowds lately, but his absence felt more ominous than his presence had been. "McKinnon!" Brett called out, his voice carrying the false heartiness that preceded trouble. "How's that horse training coming along? Town's been wondering when we'll see some actual riding instead of all this standing around talking." Thomas rose from his chair with unhurried grace, his movements betraying none of the tension that had suddenly filled the air. The spurs at his belt caught the light as he turned to face Brett, their polished surface reflecting the morning sun like a subtle reminder of authority earned rather than claimed. "Good morning, Brett," Thomas replied evenly. "Horse is coming along fine. Thanks for asking." Brett's smile had the cold edge of winter sunlight, bright but without warmth. His ranch hands flanked him like bookends, both armed and clearly accustomed to backing their boss's play with violence if necessary. These were hard men who'd learned to respect only strength, and they saw Thomas's patient approach as weakness rather than wisdom. "Been thinking about what you said the other day," Brett continued, closing the distance between them with casual menace. "About some things being healed instead of broken. Gotta wondering what a man learns about healing from Army service." The question carried implications that made Martha shift uncomfortably in her chair, while Doc Henderson's hand moved instinctively toward the medical bag that never left his side. Something in Brett's tone suggested he knew more about Thomas's background than he'd previously let on, and knowledge in the wrong hands could be as dangerous as any weapon. Thomas studied Brett with the calm assessment of a man who'd faced down charging cavalry and lived to tell the tale. "Army teaches you that every tool has its purpose," he said quietly. "Question is whether you're trying to build something or tear it down." "Building, tearing down," Brett shrugged, as if the distinction was meaningless. "All depends on perspective, doesn't it? What looks like progress to one man might look like weakness to another." The conversation was interrupted by commotion from the direction of the corral, where Devil's Shadow had begun pacing restlessly along the fence line. The stallion's agitation was clearly visible, his head high and nostrils flaring as he sensed the tension crackling between the men gathered on the porch. Thomas excused himself and walked toward the corral, his presence having an almost immediate calming effect on the agitated horse. Devil's Shadow approached the fence where Thomas stood, allowing the man to extend his hand within inches of the stallion's muzzle closer than any human had come to touching the horse since that first breakthrough moment. "Would you look at that?" Martha whispered, genuine wonder in her voice. "He's responding to Thomas from clear across the yard." Brett's expression darkened as he watched the interaction between man and horse, his jaw working as if he were chewing something bitter. The stallion's obvious preference for the quiet stranger was a public rebuke of everything Brett claimed to know about handling horses, and his reputation as the territory's premier horseman was beginning to suffer as word spread about Thomas's unconventional success. "Lucky accident," Brett muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Even his own ranch hands were watching the byplay in the corral with obvious fascination. Their attention focused on the gentle interplay between the stranger and the supposedly untamable horse. Doc Henderson rose from the porch steps with a satisfied grunt, shouldering his medical bag as he prepared to return to his office. "Doesn't look much like luck to me," he said mildly. "Looks more like two souls recognizing something in each other that the rest of us might have missed." As Brett and his men moved on down the street, their casual menace dissipating like morning mist, Thomas remained at the corral fence, speaking softly to Devil Shadow. The horse had calmed completely, his earlier agitation replaced by the watchful curiosity that had become characteristic of their interactions. Martha joined Thomas at the fence, noting how the stallion's attention remained fixed on the man, even when she approached. There was something almost protective in the horse's posture, as if he claimed this particular human as his own and was prepared to defend that claim if necessary. "He knows you belong to him now," she observed quietly. "Question is, do you know it too?" Thomas's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness she'd seen from him, transforming his weathered features and making her aware of the man he must have been before sorrow carved lines around his eyes. "I'm beginning to suspect we belong to each other," he admitted. "The question is whether that's going to be enough." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in autumn fog, when Devil Shadow finally allowed Thomas to place a gentle hand on his neck. The touch lasted only seconds before the stallion stepped away, but it represented weeks of patient progress and marked the beginning of real trust between them. Thomas felt the moment settle into his bones like warmth after a long winter, a reminder that healing was possible even for the most wounded souls. That evening, as lamplight flickered through the windows of Martha's boarding house, Thomas sat in the common room sharing stories with Jake Morrison over cups of coffee that had grown cold while they talked. Jake was a good listener, the kind of man who understood that sometimes words needed to come slowly, like water seeping through hard ground. "Was a time I thought I understood horses," Jake admitted, refilling their cups from the pot on the stove. 30 years working with them, and I figured I'd seen everything. Then you come along and show me I don't know the first thing about what goes on in their minds." Thomas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden horse, carved with the careful attention to detail that spoke of love rather than mere skill. The toy was perhaps 4 inches long, fashioned from pine and worn smooth by countless small hands. Jake could see where tiny fingers had traced the flowing mane, where a child's imagination had given life to the simple figure. "My son carved this," Thomas said quietly, setting the horse on the table between them. James was 8. When he made it, spent all winter working on it with his pocket knife. Said he was going to be a horse trainer like his daddy when he grew up. Jake studied the carved horse with the reverence due to sacred things, understanding instinctively that he was being trusted with something precious beyond measure. The craftsmanship was remarkable for a child's work, showing not just manual dexterity but an understanding of horses that went beyond mere observation. "He had the gift," Jake said finally. "You can see it in the way he shaped the legs, the arch of the neck. That's not something you can teach. That's something a person's born with." Thomas nodded, his fingers tracing the smooth wood as if touching a memory made tangible. "Sarah used to say James understood animals better than most adults. Could walk into a pasture full of strange horses and have them eating from his hand inside of 5 minutes. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street outside, where voices were raised in anger, and the sound of boots on wooden boards suggested trouble brewing. Thomas and Jake exchanged glances before moving to the window, where they could see a crowd gathering around the corral, where Devil Shadow stood alert and watchful. Brett Hawkins was at the center of the disturbance, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air as he held court with a group of ranch hands and local men who'd been drinking at the saloon. His words were slurred just enough to suggest whiskey had loosened his tongue. but not enough to impair the calculated malice in his speech. 3 weeks that stranger's been playing patty cake with that horse, Brett was saying, gesturing broadly toward the corral. 3 weeks of sweet talk and gentle touches, and what's he got to show for it? Can't even get a halter on the beast, much less ride him. One of Brett's men, a lean cowboy named Cord, who was known for his skill with difficult horses, nodded agreement. Real horsemen would have had that stallion broke to saddle by now. All this talking and standing around is just showing off for the ladies. Thomas felt his jaw tighten at the implied insult to Martha, who had indeed been watching his progress with obvious interest. But more than the personal slight, he was troubled by the undercurrent of violence in the gathered men's voices. The way they spoke of breaking Devil's Shadow, as if the horse were an enemy to be conquered rather than a partner to be won. Jake Morrison had apparently reached the same conclusion, because he was already reaching for his coat. "Better get out there before this turns ugly," he muttered. Brett's been nursing his wounded pride for weeks now, and whiskey makes him mean. They stepped onto the porch just as Sheriff Crawford emerged from his office down the street, drawn by the same instinct that had alerted them to trouble. Bill Crawford was a fair man, but not one to tolerate public disturbances, especially when they involved as many armed men as were currently surrounding the livery stable. "Evening, Brett," Crawford called out, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was both friendly and warning. "Sounds like you boys are having quite a discussion. Care to share what's got everyone so worked up?" Brett turned to face the sheriff with the exaggerated care of a man trying to appear more sober than he was. "Just talking about our friend McKinnon and his miraculous horse training methods. Been wondering when we might see some actual results, instead of all this standing around looking meaningful." Thomas had been content to observe from the porch, but the challenge in Brett's voice demanded a response. He walked slowly down the steps and across the street, his movements deliberate and unthreatening despite the tension crackling in the air. The wooden horse remained in his left hand, a talisman of innocence in a situation growing steadily more dangerous. "Results take time," Thomas said quietly, stopping just outside the circle of men surrounding the corral. "Real trust can't be rushed or forced." Brett's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Trust? That animal's a killer, McKinnon. He's put 3 men in the hospital and crippled 2 more for life. What he needs isn't trust. He needs to learn his place." Devil's Shadow had moved to the fence nearest the commotion, his ears laid back and nostrils flaring as he sensed the hostility directed toward his unlikely friend. The stallion's agitation was visible to everyone present, his powerful muscles bunched and ready for fight or flight, depending on how the situation developed. "Look at him," Brett continued, emboldened by whiskey and the murmurs of agreement from his supporters. "Even now he's ready to charge. That's not a horse you can reason with. That's a wild animal that needs to be dominated." Thomas studied the faces around him, reading the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and barely contained violence that had drawn these men together like moths to a flame. Some were genuinely interested in horse training. Others were simply hoping to see blood spilled, but all of them were watching to see how he would respond to Brett's challenge. "Every horse is different," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Some respond to force, others to patience. The trick is knowing which approach will work." "And how do you know?" Brett demanded, stepping closer with the swaggering confidence of a man who believed intimidation was always effective. "How do you know your soft-handed approach isn't just setting that horse up to kill the next man who tries to ride him?" Thomas looked down at the wooden horse in his hand, remembering James's patient work with his pocket knife during those long winter evenings when the wind howled outside their cabin and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. His son had understood something about animals that most adults never learned. That strength and gentleness were not opposites but partners, 2 aspects of the same truth. "My son taught me something about horses," Thomas said quietly, holding up the carved figure so everyone could see it. He said animals know things about people that people don't know about themselves. They can sense fear, anger, kindness, sadness, all the things we try to hide from each other. The crowd had grown quiet, drawn in despite themselves by the gentle authority in Thomas's voice and the obvious pain that accompanied his words. Even Brett seemed momentarily disarmed by the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. He said horses choose their riders as much as riders choose their horses, Thomas continued, and that the best partnerships come when both sides want the same thing. Pretty philosophy, Brett said, though his voice lacked its earlier venom. But what happens when philosophy meets reality? What happens when that horse decides he's tired of your gentle approach and goes back to breaking bones? Thomas pocketed the wooden horse and walked to the corral fence, where Devil's Shadow waited with the alert patience he'd learned to associate with their evening conversations. The stallion approached the fence willingly, allowing Thomas to extend, his hand within inches of the proud head. "They'll have learned something about trust," Thomas said simply. "And maybe he will too." The crowd began to disperse as the spectacle failed to deliver the violence some had been hoping for. But Brett lingered with his core group of supporters, his face dark with an emotion that went beyond mere disappointment. Thomas had deflected his challenge without backing down, and the quiet dignity of the response had somehow made Brett's aggression seem petty and small dot as the men drifted away toward the saloon or their homes. Martha Wade appeared at Thomas's side with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She'd been watching from her porch, and her green eyes held a mixture of admiration and concern that made Thomas aware of how much he'd come to value her good opinion. "That was well handled," she said quietly. "Brett's been looking for an excuse to make trouble, and you managed to avoid giving him one." Thomas nodded, still focused on Devil's Shadow, who had remained at the fence throughout the confrontation as if offering silent support to his human friend. For now. But men like Brett don't give up easy when their pride's been hurt. "No," Martha agreed, moving closer to the fence where the stallion waited with watchful intelligence. "They don't. Which means you better be ready for whatever comes next." As if in response to her words, Devil's Shadow stretched his neck forward and gently nuzzled Thomas's outstretched hand, the first time he'd initiated contact rather than simply allowing it. The gesture was small but significant, a declaration of alliance that both humans recognized for what it was. The horse had chosen his side. The morning Thomas successfully placed a halter on Devil's Shadow marked a turning point that rippled through Cedar Ridge like stones thrown into still water. Word spread quickly that the impossible had been accomplished, not through force or trickery, but through the kind of patient understanding that most men lacked the temperament to sustain. Thomas had replaced the cruel spike bit that hung on the corral fence with a soft leather halter of his own making, crafted from supple cowhide and fitted with brass rings that caught the morning light like promises of better days ahead. The old bit, with its sharp metal points designed to cause pain at the slightest pressure, now lay discarded in the dust like a relic from a crueler age. The transformation of the restraint itself seemed to mirror the change in Devil's Shadow, who wore the new halter with dignity rather than the fearful resistance that had characterized his response to previous attempts at handling. The leather was dyed a rich brown that complemented his black coat, and Thomas had taken care to ensure every strap was perfectly adjusted to avoid chafing or discomfort. "Never seen anything like it," Doc Henderson marveled, watching from the fence as Thomas led the stallion in a slow circle around the corral. 6 weeks ago, that animal would have killed any man who tried to put so much as a lead rope on him, and now look at him. Devil's Shadow moved with fluid grace beside Thomas, his head carried high with pride rather than fear. The horse's gait was smooth and collected, displaying the natural athleticism that had made him so coveted despite his dangerous reputation. More importantly, His attention remained focused on Thomas, responsive to subtle changes in pace or direction that spoke of genuine communication between them. Sheriff Crawford had joined the morning's audience, drawn by reports that had initially seemed too fantastic to believe. As a lawman, he'd learned to be skeptical of claims that defied common sense, but the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. The most dangerous horse in the territory was walking calmly beside a man who commanded him through nothing more than voice and gesture. "Brett's not going to like this," Crawford observed quietly to Doc Henderson. "Been telling everyone who listened that McKinnon's methods won't work, that the horse needs to be broken proper or destroyed." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Brett Hawkins appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, his face dark with an emotion that went beyond mere frustration to touch on something approaching fury. He'd staked his reputation on Thomas's failure, and the visible evidence of success was undermining everything he'd claimed to know about horse training. But it was what happened next that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. A young ranch hand named Billy Hutchins, barely 18 and known more for enthusiasm than sense, had been drinking heavily the night before and approached the corral with the swagger of youth convinced of its own immortality. "If that stranger can handle him, so can I," Billy announced loudly. His words slurred just enough to suggest he hadn't fully sobered from his previous evening's activities. Horse is just a horse, no matter how pretty he is. Before anyone could stop him, Billy climbed over the fence and into the corral, his movements clumsy and aggressive in a way that immediately put Devil Shadow on alert. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull, and his posture shifted from relaxed cooperation to coiled tension in the space of a heartbeat. Thomas reacted with the swift decisiveness of a man whose cavalry training had never truly left him. He stepped between Billy and the horse, his voice cutting through the morning air with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Easy, son. Back away slow and climb out the way you came." But Billy was young and drunk and convinced that backing down would make him look weak in front of the gathered townspeople. Instead of retreating, he pushed past Thomas and reached for Devil Shadow's halter with movements that were both clumsy and threatening. The stallion's response was immediate and violent. He reared to his full height, powerful hooves flashing through the air inches from Billy's head as a squeal of rage echoed across the corral. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, 800 pounds of furious horse towered over the foolish young man who had violated the fragile trust that Thomas had spent weeks building. But instead of striking down at the intruder, Devil's Shadow seemed to check himself in mid-attack. His eyes found Thomas, and something in the man's calm presence seemed to reach through the horse's fury and remind him that not all humans deserved his wrath. The stallion came down hard, but away from Billy, his hooves striking earth instead of flesh. Thomas moved with fluid grace, catching Billy by the arm and propelling him toward the fence with irresistible force while keeping his other hand extended toward Devil Shadow in a gesture of reassurance. His voice remained steady and calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "You're all right, boy," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he was addressing the horse or the human. "Everyone's all right. No harm done." Billy scrambled over the fence with considerably more speed than he'd shown climbing in, his face pale as he realized how close he'd come to serious injury or death. The crowd that had gathered to watch was dead silent, stunned by how quickly the situation had escalated and how decisively it had been resolved. But Thomas's attention was focused entirely on Devil Shadow, who stood trembling with residual anger and confusion in the center of the corral. The horse's trust had been shaken by the sudden intrusion, and Thomas could see in his dark eyes the old wariness beginning to reassert itself. "I know," Thomas said softly, approaching the stallion with hands extended and voice pitched to carry reassurance rather than command. "I know he scared you, but you showed restraint, boy. You chose not to hurt him when you could have. Devil's Shadow allowed Thomas to approach and place gentle hands on his neck. Though his muscles remained tense and his breathing was elevated from the encounter, the horse's nostrils flared as he tested the air for signs of additional threats, his survival instincts warring with the trust he'd learned to place in his human partner. "That's what real strength looks like," Thomas continued, his voice carrying clearly to the watching crowd. "The power to hurt someone and the wisdom to choose not to." Brett Hawkins pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with an expression that mingled disappointment with something darker. He'd clearly been hoping for disaster, for vindication of his claim that Devil's Shadow was irredeemably dangerous and that Thomas's methods were naive foolishness. "Lucky accident," Brett said loudly, though his voice lacked conviction. "That horse would have killed Billy if he hadn't slipped." Thomas turned to face Brett directly, and for a moment, the two men regarded each other across a divide that had nothing to do with physical distance. In Thomas's eyes, Brett saw something that made him step backward involuntarily, not anger or aggression, but the kind of quiet certainty that came from surviving things that would have broken lesser men. "Devil's Shadow made a choice," Thomas said simply. "Same choice every man makes every day, whether to respond to fear with violence or to find another way." The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversation about what they had witnessed. Some focused on the near disaster that had been averted, others on the remarkable restraint the stallion had shown, but all agreed that they had seen something extraordinary in that dusty corral. Henderson approached Thomas as he continued to calm the agitated horse, his medical bag in hand, despite the lack of injuries to treat. "Remarkable," the physician said quietly. "That animal had every reason to strike, every instinct telling him to defend himself, but he chose not to." Thomas nodded, still focused on Devil's Shadow, who was gradually relaxing under the influence of gentle hands and soothing words. "He's learning that not all threats are real, that not every human who approaches means him harm, but its fragile trust always is." Martha Wade had watched the entire incident from her porch, and now she approached the corral with something that might have been pride shining in her green eyes. She'd seen Thomas's quick thinking and calm decisiveness, the way he'd managed to protect both horse and human while maintaining the careful trust he'd built over weeks of patient work. "Billy Hutchins ought to thank you for saving his life," she said quietly, "and maybe apologize for nearly destroying what you've accomplished here." Thomas managed a tired smile, the first expression of genuine emotion he'd shown since the confrontation began. "Young men make mistakes. The important thing is that everyone learned something today." As the sun climbed higher and the crowd finally dispersed, Thomas remained in the corral with Devil's Shadow, rebuilding the trust that had been shaken by Billy's foolish intrusion. It would take time to fully restore the bond between them, but the foundation remained solid. The horse had shown remarkable restraint, and Thomas had proven himself capable of protecting both of them when circumstances demanded it. But as Brett Hawkins walked away with his supporters, his face dark with frustrated ambition, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this had been only the first test of what they had built together. There would be others, and not all of them would be as easily resolved as Billy Hutchins's drunken bravado. The day Thomas first rode Devil's Shadow dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows of Cedar Ridge in delicate patterns that would melt away as soon as the sun climbed above the eastern mountains. Thomas had risen earlier than usual, drawn by an intuition that today would mark another milestone in the careful relationship he built with the stallion over the past 2 months. In his vest pocket, he carried a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father, its hands frozen at 3:47, the exact time recorded on the telegram that had brought news of his family's death 3 years ago. He'd stopped winding the watch that terrible day, unable to bear the sound of time continuing when his world had ended. But this morning, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, He'd found himself turning the crown and listening to the familiar tick resume its steady rhythm. The watch felt warm against his chest as he approached Devil Shadow's corral, where the stallion waited with the alert patience that had become characteristic of their morning encounters. The horse's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the early light, and his eyes held an intelligence that never failed to remind Thomas that he was dealing with a partner rather than a possession. "Morning, boy," Thomas said softly, letting himself into the corral with the unhurried movements that had become second nature. "What do you say we try something new today?" Devil Shadow approached willingly, allowing Thomas to slip the soft leather halter over his head and adjust the straps. With practiced ease, the horse stood quietly while Thomas ran gentle hands along his neck and shoulders, checking for any signs of soreness or tension that might make riding inadvisable. The saddle Thomas had chosen was his own cavalry saddle, worn smooth by years of use but carefully maintained and perfectly fitted to his body. He'd spent the previous evening treating the leather with neat's foot oil, ensuring that every strap and buckle was in perfect condition. This saddle had carried him through 3 years of war and countless miles of frontier travel, and it felt appropriate that it should be part of this moment as well. Word had somehow spread that today might bring the first attempt at riding, because a larger crowd than usual had gathered despite the early hour. Martha Wade stood on her porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, while Doc Henderson waited near the corral fence with his medical bag conspicuously displayed. Even Sheriff Crawford had found reasons to patrol the street near the livery stable, but it was the absence of Brett Hawkins that made Thomas most uneasy. The rancher had been conspicuously present at every previous milestone, ready with criticism or dire predictions of disaster. His failure to appear this morning suggested he was planning something that required his attention elsewhere, and Thomas had learned to be wary of Brett's unexpected absences. Thomas approached the saddling with the same patience he'd shown in every other aspect of training. He allowed Devil Shadow to inspect the saddle thoroughly, letting the horse smell the leather and investigate the unfamiliar object that would soon rest on his back. The stallion showed curiosity rather than fear, nuzzling the saddle with the same careful attention he'd given to the halter weeks earlier. "That's right," Thomas murmured, running his hand along the horse's neck in long, soothing strokes. "Nothing here that's going to hurt you. Just another step in learning to trust each other." The blanket went on first, positioned carefully to avoid any bunching or wrinkles that might cause discomfort. Devil Shadow stood quietly, though Thomas could feel the slight tension in his muscles that suggested readiness to move if the situation became threatening. The horse's ears remained forward, focused on Thomas's voice and movements rather than scanning for danger. The saddle itself required more delicate handling. Thomas lifted it slowly, allowing Devil Shadow to see and smell it again before settling it gently onto the horse's back. The stallion flinched slightly at the initial contact, but didn't move away, his trust in Thomas overriding his instinctive wariness of unfamiliar sensations. Cinching the girth was the most dangerous moment, as this was when most horses decided they tolerated enough strange treatment and either bolted or fought. Thomas worked with deliberate care, tightening the strap gradually and pausing frequently to ensure Devil Shadow remained calm and accepting. "Easy, boy," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized every interaction between them. "Almost ready now. Just need to make sure everything's secure." The watching crowd had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the children who had been playing in the street had stopped to stare at the unlikely partnership being forged in the dusty corral. This was more than entertainment. This was a demonstration that patience and understanding could triumph over fear and violence. Thomas checked the stirrups one final time, then gathered the reins in his left hand while placing his right hand on the saddle horn. Devil Shadow turned his head to watch, curious about this new behavior, but showing no signs of panic or aggression. The horse's breathing remained steady, and his posture suggested attention rather than alarm. The moment of mounting was quick and smooth. Thomas's cavalry training evident in the fluid grace with which he swung into the saddle. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, man and horse stood perfectly still, both adjusting to the new reality of their partnership. Then Devil Shadow took his first step with a rider on his back in over 3 years. The movement was tentative, exploratory, as if the stallion was testing this new arrangement to see if it felt as safe as it looked. Thomas sat quietly in the saddle, making no demands or attempts to direct the horse's movement, allowing Devil Shadow to grow accustomed to the weight and balance of carrying a rider. A collective sigh rose from the watching crowd, followed by scattered applause that quickly died away as people realized the delicate nature of what they were witnessing. This was not a performance, but a conversation between two souls who had learned to trust each other despite their past wounds. Thomas guided Devil Shadow into a slow walk around the perimeter of the corral, using gentle pressure from his legs and subtle shifts in weight rather than pulling on the reins. The horse responded beautifully, his natural grace enhanced rather than constrained by the presence of a rider who understood that true partnership required cooperation rather than domination. "Look at that," Martha whispered to Doc Henderson, wonder evident in her voice. "He's not fighting it at all. It's like he was waiting for the right person to come along." Doc nodded, his experienced eye noting the fluid harmony between horse and rider. "McKinnon's not trying to control him, he's working with him. That's the difference between breaking a horse and training one." As they completed their second circuit of the corral, Thomas felt Devil Shadow relax completely beneath him, the stallion's powerful muscles moving with the fluid rhythm that had made him so prized before his traumatic experiences with cruel handling. This was what the horse had been meant for, not as a victim to be dominated, but as a partner in the ancient dance between human and equine. Thomas brought Devil Shadow to a halt near the fence where the largest group of spectators had gathered, his face showing the quiet satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something he'd begun to doubt was possible. The pocket watch in his vest seemed to tick louder, marking time that was moving forward again after 3 years of standing still. "Wow, I'll be damned," Jake Morrison said quietly, shaking his head in amazement. 3 years that horse stood in that corral like a statue, and now look at him, moving like he was born to carry a rider. It was then that Brett Hawkins finally made his appearance. Arriving with a group of men Thomas didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals, with the kind of hard eyes that suggested they were more familiar with violence than honest work. Brett's face was dark with frustrated anger, his carefully constructed reputation as the territory's premier horseman crumbling with every graceful step Devil Shadow took. "Impressive show," Brett called out, his voice carrying an edge that made several people in the crowd step back nervously. But riding a horse in a corral isn't the same as working cattle or covering rough country. That animal's still dangerous, no matter how pretty he looks with a saddle on him. Thomas dismounted with the same fluid grace he'd shown in mounting, his movements calm and deliberate despite the obvious hostility in Brett's voice. Devil Shadow remained perfectly still, his attention focused on Thomas rather than the potential threat posed by the newcomers. "Every horse is dangerous if you don't treat him right," Thomas replied quietly, his hand resting on Devil Shadow's neck in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. "Question is whether you're trying to work with him or against him." The confrontation might have escalated from there, but it was interrupted by the arrival of a young boy who came running down the street with the breathless urgency of someone bearing important news. The child, Thomas, recognized him as one of the stable hands from the hotel, skidded to a stop near Sheriff Crawford and delivered his message in gasping bursts. "Sheriff, Mr. Morrison, there's been trouble at the Brennan Ranch. Cattle missing and the fence lines cut. Mr. Brennan says it looks like rustlers hit them sometime in the night. The news cast a pall over the celebration, reminding everyone that larger dangers existed. Beyond the careful world Thomas had built with Devil's Shadow in the confines of the corral, cattle rustling was a serious threat in territory where the nearest law enforcement might be days away, and organized thieves could devastate a rancher's livelihood in a single night. Sheriff Crawford immediately began organizing a posse to investigate the theft, but his eyes kept returning to Thomas and Devil's Shadow with speculative interest. A horse that could move with such grace and respond to such subtle commands would be invaluable for tracking thieves across rough terrain. "McKinnon," Crawford said finally, "that horse of yours might be exactly what we need for this kind of work. You interested in helping us track down some cattle thieves?" Thomas looked at Devil's Shadow, who stood quietly beside him with ears pricked forward as if listening to the conversation. The stallion had proven he could be trusted with a rider, but tracking criminals across dangerous territory would test their partnership in ways that no amount of corral training could prepare them for. Dot in his vest pocket. The silver watch continued, its steady ticking marking the passage of time that was no longer standing still. Thomas realized that his period of healing was ending, and the time for testing what he had rebuilt was beginning. "We'll be ready whenever you need us," he said quietly, the pronoun encompassing both himself and the horse who had become his partner. In more than just training, the rustlers struck again 3 nights later, this time hitting Jake Morrison's own livery stable with a boldness that shocked the entire town. They made off with 6 of the finest horses in the territory, including 2 breeding mares that represented Jake's life savings and future hopes. But it was what they left behind that would change everything Thomas thought he knew about the threat. Facing Cedar Ridge, the discovery came at dawn when Jake arrived to feed the animals and found the stable doors standing open like gaping wounds in the morning light. The thieves had worked with surgical precision, taking only the most valuable animals while leaving the older horses and the supplies untouched. It was the work of professionals who knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it without unnecessary violence or destruction. Thomas and Devil's Shadow were among the first to respond to Jake's anguished calls for help, the stallion moving with eager alertness as if he sensed the urgency of the situation. The horse had continued to develop since that first successful ride, becoming more responsive and athletic with each passing day, but this would be his first real test outside the controlled environment of the corral. Sheriff Crawford was already examining the scene when they arrived, his experienced eye taking in details that spoke to the organized nature of the theft. The lock on the stable door had been picked rather than broken, suggesting someone with specialized skills, and the tracks leading away from town showed evidence of careful planning and execution. "Professional job," Crawford muttered, kneeling to examine hoofprints in the soft earth. These weren't opportunistic drifters. Someone planned this operation carefully. Thomas dismounted and studied the tracks with the trained eye of a cavalry scout, noting details that others might miss. The thieves had used cloth wrappings to muffle their horses' hooves, and they'd taken care to obliterate most of their trail by driving the stolen animals through a nearby creek. But there were signs for those who knew how to read them. 6 riders, Thomas observed, pointing to subtle variations in the track patterns, well-mounted and well-organized. They knew exactly which animals to take and how to get them out quickly. It was Doc Henderson who made the discovery that changed everything. While the others focused on the obvious signs of theft, the physician's methodical mind had led him to examine the areas the thieves hadn't touched. In a stall at the back of the stable, hidden beneath a pile of old tack, he found a leather saddlebag that had apparently been dropped during the hurried departure. "Sheriff," Doc called quietly, his voice carrying an odd tension that made everyone turn to look at him. "You need to see this." The saddlebag contained the usual miscellany of trail gear, jerky, tobacco, ammunition for a .45 caliber, revolver, but it was the folded paper tucked into an interior pocket that made Crawford's face go pale. He unfolded it carefully, his hand steady despite the implications of what he was reading. It was a wanted poster, printed on official paper with the territorial seal clearly visible at the top. The face staring back at them was unmistakably Brett Hawkins, though the name beneath the photograph read, Benjamin Butcher Hayes, wanted for armed robbery, cattle rustling and murder in the territories of Colorado and Wyoming. Reward, $500 dead or alive. The silence that followed the discovery was deafening, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the distant sound of morning activity in the town beyond. Everyone present understood immediately that they had been living among a dangerous criminal for months, accepting him as a successful rancher while he used Cedar Ridge as a base for organized theft. Butcher Hayes, Crawford said quietly, his voice filled with the kind of grim recognition that came from studying too many wanted posters over the years. Should have recognized the name when I heard about his methods with horses. This man's been wanted in 3 territories for crimes that go back 5 years. Thomas felt Devil's shadow tense beneath him, responding to the sudden change in emotional atmosphere with the sensitivity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. The Stallion's ears were pricked forward, alert to dangers. His human partner was only beginning to understand. He's been using the ranch as a cover, Thomas realized, the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. All those men he's had working for him, all the talk about needing tough hands for difficult horses. He's been building a gang right under our noses. The implications were staggering. Brett, or Benjamin Hayes, as they now knew him, had positioned himself as one of Cedar Ridge's most prominent citizens, while organizing a criminal enterprise that threatened the livelihood of everyone in the territory. His antagonism toward Thomas's gentle methods with Devil's Shadow hadn't been about horse training philosophy. It had been about eliminating a potential threat to his operations. We have to assume he knows we found this, Crawford said grimly, tucking the wanted poster into his coat, which means he'll either run or make a stand, and neither option is good for the people of this town. Martha Wade had arrived during the discussion, drawn by the commotion and the gathering crowd of concerned citizens. Her face went white when Crawford explained what they had discovered, the full implications of having harbored a known killer, settling over her like a cold fog. "He's been eating at my boarding house," she whispered, her voice filled with horror at the realization. "Sitting at my table, making conversation about the weather and the price of cattle. All this time, he was planning to steal from us." Thomas felt a cold fury building in his chest, not the hot anger that led to rash actions, but the controlled rage of a professional soldier who understood that some men could only be stopped through force. Hayes had used the town's hospitality as a cover for his criminal activities, and worse, he'd been preparing to destroy the fragile trust Thomas had built with Devil's Shadow for reasons that had nothing to do with horse training. "How many men does he have?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had emerged during his cavalry service. "And how well are they armed?" Crawford considered the question carefully, mentally cataloging the faces he'd seen around Brett's ranch over the past few months. At least 8 or 9 regulars, maybe more that he keeps out of sight. All of them armed and experienced, if this poster's accurate about his previous activities. The situation was worse than a simple case of cattle rustling. They were facing an organized gang led by a man with experience in violence and no scruples about using it against innocent people. Cedar Ridge had no military garrison, no federal marshals, and insufficient firepower to face such a threat through conventional means. It was then that Devil's Shadow made his contribution to the discussion. Lifting his head and staring intently toward the eastern edge of town, where dust clouds suggested approaching riders, the Stallion's posture shifted from alert attention to something approaching alarm, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for scents that might explain his uneasiness. "Company coming," Thomas said quietly, trusting the horse's superior senses. Over his own eyes, Devil Shadow had proven himself capable of detecting threats long before humans became aware of them, a skill that had undoubtedly contributed to his survival during the traumatic experiences that had shaped his wariness of strangers. The riders emerged from the morning, haze like specters materializing from the frontier itself, 8 men mounted on good horses and armed with the casual efficiency of professionals who expected trouble and were prepared to meet it with violence. At their head rode Brett Hawkins, though he now carried himself with the confident menace of a man who had stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. "Looks like our secret's out," Brett called as he reined in his horse 30 yards from the gathered townspeople. His voice carried the same jovial tone he'd always used, but now it was underlaid with something cold and predatory that made children instinctively move closer to their parents. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture that was both practiced and probably fuel against such odds. "Benjamin Hayes," he said clearly, using the criminal's real name like an accusation. "You're under arrest for cattle rustling, armed robbery, and murder in 3 territories." Brett's laugh was genuinely amused, as if the sheriff had told a particularly good joke. "Arrest? Bill, you're a decent man and a fair sheriff, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed if everyone just stays calm and thinks reasonable." The menace in his words was clear despite the reasonable tone. Hayes had revealed himself, and now he was offering the town a choice: submission or destruction. His men sat their horses with the casual alertness of predators, hands resting near weapons while their eyes scanned the gathering crowd for signs of resistance. "What do you want?" Crawford asked bluntly, recognizing the negotiation might be their only chance of avoiding immediate violence. "Same thing I've always wanted," Brett replied easily. "To make a living in territory that's rich with opportunities for men smart enough to take advantage of them. Cedar Ridge has been good to me, and I see no reason that can't continue." Thomas felt Devil's Shadow trembling with controlled energy beneath him, the stallion's survival instincts warring with the trust he'd learned to place in his human partner. The horse could sense the danger radiating from the mounted men, but he remained steady beneath Thomas's calming hand, proof of how far their relationship had evolved. "You've been stealing from these people," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Using their hospitality to cover crimes that hurt families trying to make honest livings." Brett's attention focused on Thomas with the intensity of a predator identifying a particular threat. "Ah, our famous horse whisperer. I wondered when you'd find your voice in all this. Tell me, McKinnon, what's a man with your military background doing playing with horses in a nowhere town like Cedar Ridge?" The question carried implications that made Thomas's blood run cold. Hayes had clearly done research into his background, which meant he knew about Thomas's cavalry service and possibly about the tragedy that had driven him west. The criminal's smile suggested he was prepared to use that knowledge as a weapon. "Some of us are trying to build something instead of tearing it down," Thomas replied evenly, though his hand moved unconsciously to check the position of his service revolver. The weight of the weapon was familiar and comforting, a reminder of skills he'd hoped never to need again. "Building," Brett mused, as if considering the concept from an academic perspective. "Interesting philosophy. But building requires materials, and materials cost money, and money has to come from somewhere. I prefer the direct approach." Doc Henderson had been edging slowly toward his medical office during the conversation, clearly hoping to reach the shotgun he kept there for emergencies. But one of Brett's men noticed the movement and swung his rifle to cover the physician, ending that hope with casual efficiency. "Now, Doc," Brett said without turning around, "let's not do anything we'll all regret. This can stay civilized if everyone remembers their manners." It was then that Thomas realized the true scope of what they were facing. Hayes wasn't planning to rob the town and leave. He intended to take control of Cedar Ridge entirely, using it as a permanent base for his criminal operations while the residents lived under the constant threat of violence. "You can't hold a whole town hostage," Martha said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "People will come looking for us eventually. Federal marshals, territorial governors. We'll find a prosperous community run by successful ranchers." Brett finished smoothly. "Amazing how cooperative people can be when they understand the alternatives. Ask the folks in Willow Creek how well they've adapted to new management." The reference to Willow Creek sent a chill through everyone present. The town had simply vanished from all communication 6 months ago, its residents presumably scattered or worse. Now, they understood what had really happened there, and the knowledge made resistance seem both futile and necessary. Thomas felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd spent 3 years running from responsibility, from the necessity of making choices that might cost lives. But Cedar Ridge had become home in ways he hadn't expected. These people had accepted him, and Devil's Shadow had taught him that healing was possible, even for the most wounded souls. The stallion beneath him sensed his rider's emotional shift, muscles coiling in preparation for whatever demand might be made of their partnership. Devil's Shadow had learned to trust Thomas's judgment, and if the man decided to fight, the horse would carry him into battle with the same loyalty he'd shown in the peaceful confines of the training corral. "You're making a mistake," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "This town has friends you don't know about, and some of us aren't as helpless as we might look." Brett's smile widened, showing teeth that were white and predatory. "Is that a threat, horse trainer?" "Because I should probably mention that accidents happen to people who make threats they can't back up." The morning air was filled with tension that seemed to crackle like electricity before a storm, while Devil's Shadow stood like a coiled spring beneath his rider, ready for whatever might come next. Thomas realized that everything he built in Cedar Ridge, the trust of the townspeople, his partnership with the Stallion, even his growing feelings for Martha Wade, now hung in the balance of what happened in the next few minutes. The time for healing was over. The time for fighting had begun. The uneasy standoff that followed. Brett's revelation lasted through the longest day Cedar Ridge had ever known. Hayes and his men withdrew to positions on the hills surrounding the town, close enough to observe all movement but far enough away to avoid any desperate assault by the townspeople. It was a siege without walls, maintained through the simple threat of overwhelming firepower rather than physical barriers. Thomas spent the daylight hours moving through Cedar Ridge like a general preparing for battle, his service revolver cleaned and loaded for the first time since he'd arrived in town. The weight of the weapon felt both familiar and foreign, a reminder of skills he'd hoped to leave buried with his past but might now need to save his future. The gun was a Colt Army Model 1860, carried through 3 years of cavalry service and maintained with the obsessive care of a professional soldier who understood that his life might depend on its reliability. Thomas had killed men with this weapon during the war, necessary deaths that had haunted his dreams until grief for his family had displaced all other sorrows. Now he prepared to use it again, not for military objectives or political causes, but for people who had become precious to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "How many fighting men can we count on?" he asked Sheriff Crawford as they met in the back room of the jail, where they could speak freely without being observed from the surrounding hills. Crawford consulted a list he'd been compiling throughout the day, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to organize a defense with inadequate resources. 12 men with military experience, maybe 8 more who can handle rifles well enough to be useful. Doc Henderson fought in the war, and Jake Morrison was a territorial ranger before he settled down to horse breeding. The numbers were grimly inadequate against Hayes's professional gang. But Thomas had learned during the cavalry that battles were often won by factors other than simple arithmetic. Terrain, surprise, and the determination of men fighting for their homes could sometimes overcome superior firepower, though the cost was always higher than anyone wanted to pay. What about ammunition and defensive positions? Thomas continued, his mind automatically shifting into the tactical planning mode that had kept him alive during the war's bloodiest campaigns. Hotel has a good view of the main street, and the church steeple would make an excellent sniper's nest if we can get someone up there, Crawford replied. Martha's boarding house has thick walls and a clear field of fire toward the livery stable. Thomas nodded, visualizing the town's layout from a military perspective and identifying choke points where a smaller force might hold off larger numbers through superior positioning. Cedar Ridge had been built for commerce rather than defense, but every settlement had advantages that could be exploited by men who understood the principles of warfare. Martha Wade appeared in the doorway carrying a coffee pot and 3 cups, her green eyes showing the determined calm of a woman who had decided to face whatever came with dignity intact. She'd spent the day organizing the women and children into groups that could provide support for the fighting men while staying out of the direct line of fire. The women want to know what they can do to help, she said, pouring coffee with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the circumstances. We're not going to hide in root cellars while our men fight for our lives. Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Martha's presence seemed to steady everyone around her. She had become the unofficial leader of the town's civilian population, organizing them with the same efficiency she brought to running her boarding house. Her courage in the face of mortal danger reminded him of his wife Sarah, who had possessed the same combination of strength and grace under pressure. Medical supplies, Thomas said finally. Doc Henderson's going to have more work than he can handle before this is over. And someone needs to coordinate messages between the fighting positions. That'll be dangerous work, but it's essential for maintaining communication. Martha nodded, mentally adding these tasks to the list she was already carrying. The children? Hidden cellar under the church, Crawford replied. Father Mackenzie's agreed to stay with them, and it's the most defensible position in town if everything else falls apart. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed ominously appropriate, Thomas made his way to the livery stable, where Devil Shadow waited with the patient alertness that had become characteristic of their partnership. The Stallion had sensed the change in atmosphere throughout the day, his ears constantly moving as he tracked sounds and scents that might signal approaching danger. Thomas saddled the horse with particular care, checking every strap and buckle twice before adjusting the special war bridle he'd crafted during the afternoon. The bridle was designed for combat conditions, with reinforced leather and additional rings that would allow for better control during the chaos of battle. Most importantly, it incorporated subtle modifications that would let Devil Shadow respond to leg pressure and weight shifts even if the reins were cut or Thomas was wounded. "We've come a long way together, boy," Thomas said quietly, running his hands along the stallion's powerful neck. "Tonight's going to test everything we've learned about trusting each other." Devil Shadow turned his head to regard his rider, with dark eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond mere animal intelligence. The horse had been transformed from a creature consumed by fear and anger into a partner capable of responding to the subtlest communication. But more than that, he had learned to trust Thomas's judgment even in situations that triggered his deepest survival instincts. Doc Henderson arrived at the stable as Thomas was completing his preparations, the elderly physician carrying his medical bag and a Spencer rifle that showed signs of careful maintenance. His scholarly appearance was somewhat belied by the competent way he handled the weapon, a reminder that many men in the territory had backgrounds that included more violence than their current occupations might suggest. "Remarkable transformation," Doc observed, watching Devil Shadow accept the war bridle without resistance. 6 months ago, that animal would have killed anyone who tried to put military tack on him. Now he's preparing for battle like a seasoned cavalry mount. Horses understand more than people give them credit for, Thomas replied, securing his rifle in its saddle scabbard with practiced efficiency. He knows we're facing something dangerous, and he's choosing to face it with me instead of running away. The parallel between horse and rider was not lost on either man. Thomas had also been transformed by his time in Cedar Ridge, changing from a grief-stricken drifter into someone willing to fight for a community that had become home. Both man and horse had found healing through trust, and now they were prepared to risk everything they had built together to protect it. Jake Morrison joined them as the last light faded from the western sky, his face grim with the knowledge that his livery stable would likely be a primary target when the fighting began. Hayes needed horses for his operations, and the theft of the town's remaining animals would cripple any attempt at pursuit or escape. "They'll come after midnight," Jake predicted, checking the loads in his shotgun with the methodical care of a man who'd had to fight for his life before. Hayes likes to hit when people are tired and disoriented. Learned that from studying his previous jobs. Thomas nodded, his cavalry experience confirming Jake's assessment. Night attacks were a favorite tactic of raiders and guerrilla fighters, offering the advantages of surprise and confusion while negating some of the defensive benefits of prepared positions. Hayes would want to end the fight quickly, before federal authorities could respond to reports of trouble in Cedar Ridge. "Signal will be the church bell," Thomas said, reviewing the plan they developed throughout the day. "One long ring means they're coming. 2 short rings means fall back to secondary positions. 3 long rings means retreat to the church." The plan was simple by necessity, complex enough to coordinate their limited forces, but not so complicated that it would fall apart under the stress of combat. Each man knew his position and his responsibilities, though they all understood that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged. As the hours passed and midnight approached, Thomas found himself thinking about the letter he'd written earlier. In the evening, words addressed to his deceased wife and son that he'd never intended anyone else to read. In it, he tried to explain how Cedar Ridge had given him reasons to hope again, how Devil's Shadow had taught him that broken things could heal, and how the prospect of fighting for something precious had awakened parts of himself he'd thought lost forever. The letter rested in his saddlebags alongside the wooden horse James had carved and the photograph that had sustained him through 3 years of wandering. If he didn't survive the coming battle, perhaps someone would find these artifacts and understand that Thomas McKinnon had discovered something worth dying for in the unlikely friendship between a damaged man and an equally wounded horse. Martha Wade appeared one final time before the battle began, carrying a cup of coffee that had grown cold during her walk from the boarding house. Her presence was both comfort and torment, a reminder of possibilities that might never be explored if Hayes' gang proved victorious in the coming fight. "Promise me something," she said quietly, standing close enough to Devil's Shadow that the Stallion's breath stirred her hair. "Promise me you'll come back." Thomas looked down at her from the saddle, memorizing the way lamplight caught the copper highlights in her auburn hair and the determined set of her shoulders despite the fear he could see in her green eyes. She represented everything he thought he'd lost forever, the possibility of love, of family, of a future that included more than merely surviving from one day to the next. "I promise to try," he said finally, the most honest answer he could give. "Devil's Shadow and we're going to give them the fight of their lives." In the distance, they could hear the sound of horses moving through the darkness, accompanied by the occasional clink of metal on metal that suggested armed men approaching their positions. Hayes was coming, and the time for preparation was over. The battle for Cedar Ridge was about to begin. The attack came at 2 in the morning, when exhaustion weighed heavy on the defenders and the darkness seemed absolute beyond the feeble circles of light cast by their lanterns. Thomas had positioned himself and Devil's Shadow on the ridge overlooking the main approach to town, where his cavalry training and the Stallion's superior senses could provide early warning of Hayes' assault. Devil's Shadow felt them coming before Thomas heard the first hoofbeat, the horse's ears swiveling toward sounds too faint for human perception, while his muscles tensed with anticipatory energy. The Stallion had learned to trust his rider's tactical judgment, but his survival instincts remained sharp enough to detect threats that Thomas's war-trained senses might miss. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered, his hand moving to check the special war bridle one final time. The leather was supple but strong, designed to maintain communication between horse and rider even under the most chaotic conditions. "We see them coming. We get word to the others. Then we make them pay for every yard." The first shapes emerged from the darkness like phantoms given substance. Hayes' gang moving with the practiced coordination of men who had conducted similar raids across 3 territories. They rode in a loose skirmish line designed to present multiple targets while concentrating firepower, a tactic that had clearly served them well in previous encounters with unprepared civilians. Thomas counted 8 riders in the main assault force, which meant Hayes was holding at least 2 men in reserve for contingencies or to cut off escape routes. The criminal had learned from military experience, even if his application of those lessons served only greed and violence rather than legitimate objectives. Devil's Shadow remained perfectly still as Thomas used hand signals to communicate with the hidden defenders positioned throughout Cedar Ridge, relaying information about the attackers' numbers and approach routes. The Stallion's dark coat rendered them nearly invisible against the night sky, a natural camouflage enhanced by Thomas's careful positioning and the horse's own understanding of the need for stealth. The church bell rang once, its bronze voice carrying clearly through the cool night air to alert every defender that the battle had begun. Thomas felt Devil's Shadow's muscles coil beneath him as the Stallion prepared for whatever demands might be made of their partnership in the coming minutes. Hayes himself was easy to identify even in the poor light, his confident bearing and position at the center of the assault formation marking him as clearly as a uniform. The criminal rode a powerful bay gelding that showed evidence of careful breeding and training, a mount suitable for a man who depended on superior horseflesh to stay ahead of the law. "There," Thomas breathed, raising his rifle and settling into the familiar routine of long-range shooting that had kept him alive during the war. The target was challenging in the darkness, but not impossible for a marksman with his experience and the advantage of elevation. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, followed immediately by Hayes' cry of pain and surprise as the bullet took him high in the left shoulder, spinning him half around in his saddle before he managed to regain his balance. It wasn't a killing shot, but it served notice that Cedar Ridge would not fall without a fight. "Sniper on the ridge!" Hayes roared, his voice carrying the rage of a man unaccustomed to meeting organized resistance. "Cord, take 3 men and flush him out." Thomas was already moving as the gang split their forces, Devil's Shadow responding to leg pressure and weight shifts with the fluid grace that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. The Stallion understood that speed and mobility were their primary advantages against superior numbers, and he moved through the darkness with sure-footed confidence despite the treacherous terrain. Muzzle flashes began to light the night as the defenders in town opened fire from their prepared positions, creating a deadly crossfire that caught the main assault force in a withering barrage of rifle shots. Sheriff Crawford's careful positioning was paying dividends, forcing Hayes' men to seek cover while giving the townspeople clear fields of fire. But Cord and his 3 companions were climbing the ridge with grim determination, their horses struggling up the steep slope while they returned fire toward Thomas's last known position. These were experienced fighters who understood that eliminating the sniper was essential to breaking the town's defense. Devil's Shadow carried Thomas along the ridgeline with breathtaking speed, his hooves finding purchase on surfaces that would have challenged lesser horses, while his rider continued to engage targets of opportunity with deadly precision. The stallion had become an extension of Thomas's will, responding to commands so subtle they seemed almost telepathic. Another shot, and one of Cord's men tumbled from his saddle to lie motionless on the rocky slope. Thomas worked the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency, already selecting his next target while Devil Shadow adjusted position to maintain their tactical advantage. The return fire was getting closer, bullets whining through the air near, enough to make Devil Shadow's ears flick nervously. But the stallion never broke stride or showed any inclination to bolt. The horse had learned to trust Thomas's judgment absolutely, even when that judgment led them into mortal danger. "Got you now, you bastard," Cord shouted, spurring his horse toward a position that would give him a clear shot at the elusive sniper. But Thomas had anticipated the move, positioning Devil Shadow behind a natural rock formation that provided both cover and an unobstructed view of the approaching threat. The range was less than 50 yards when Thomas took his shot, the heavy rifle bullet striking Cord's center mass and lifting him from his saddle with brutal finality. The remaining two riders reined in their horses, suddenly aware that they were facing someone with professional military training rather than an amateur defender. Below in the town, the battle was reaching its crescendo as Hayes's main force pressed their attack against increasingly desperate resistance. Muzzle flashes lit windows like malevolent stars, while the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood announced the destruction of property that had taken years to build. Thomas could see Sheriff Crawford's position at the hotel, where the lawman was methodically picking off targets with the patience of an experienced hunter. Doc Henderson had barricaded himself in his office and was providing covering fire for wounded defenders, his Spencer rifle adding its voice to the defensive chorus. But it was Martha, Wade's boarding house, that drew Thomas's immediate attention, as Hayes himself led a group of dismounted men in a direct assault on the building where the townswomen had taken shelter. The criminal was clearly following a deliberate strategy, intending to take hostages who could be used to force the defenders' surrender. "Time to go to work, boy," Thomas said quietly, checking his rifle one final time before securing it in its scabbard. The remaining two riders on the ridge were pinned down by his accurate fire, but the real battle was developing in the streets, below, where superior numbers were beginning to tell against the outnumbered defenders. Devil Shadow seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, gathering himself for the treacherous descent from the ridge with the focused intensity of a horse who had learned that his rider's survival might depend on split-second timing and absolute trust between them. The stallion picked his way down the steep slope with the agility of a mountain goat, his powerful hindquarters driving him forward while his rider remained perfectly balanced despite the challenging terrain. This was why cavalry units prized intelligent, athletic horses above all other qualities, the ability to carry a fighting man wherever the battle demanded, regardless of obstacles or dangers. They reached the outskirts of town just as Hayes's assault on the boarding house reached its climax, with the criminal and 4 of his men taking cover behind a overturned wagon while they poured rifle fire into the building's windows. Martha and the other women were trapped inside, their situation growing more desperate with each passing minute. Thomas drew his service revolver as Devil Shadow charged down the main street with the fury of a cavalry assault, hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth while his rider prepared for close-quarters combat. The stallion moved like liquid lightning, his powerful stride eating up the distance between them and Hayes's position with breathtaking speed. The first of Hayes's men heard them coming and turned just in time to take Thomas's bullet center mass, the heavy .44 caliber round spinning him around before he collapsed behind the overturned wagon. The sound of the gunshot and the thunder of hooves announced their arrival more dramatically than any battle cry. "Behind you!" Hayes roared, swinging his rifle toward the charging horse and rider while his remaining men scrambled to adjust their positions. But Devil Shadow was already among them, his hooves becoming weapons as deadly as any gun, while Thomas fired with the controlled precision of a cavalry officer leading a saber charge. The stallion reared at Thomas's command, 800 pounds of muscle and bone rising above the terrified gang members like an avenging spirit from their worst nightmares. His front hoof struck down at Hayes himself, missing the criminal's head by inches as the man threw himself sideways in desperate self-preservation. Thomas, single quotes, second shot, took another gang member in the shoulder, sending him sprawling while his rifle discharged harmlessly into the night sky. The remaining attackers found themselves caught between the fury of the horse above them and the steady rifle fire from the boarding house, where Martha and her companions had taken advantage of the distraction to return effective fire. "Kill that horse!" Hayes screamed, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder as he tried to bring his weapon to bear on Devil Shadow. But the stallion was moving too quickly, responding to Thomas's commands with the fluid grace that had made them nearly unstoppable during their charge. Devil's Shadow came down from his rear and immediately spun to face another threat, his teeth bared in a savage display that spoke to the wild spirit that still burned beneath his trained exterior. The horse had learned to fight alongside his rider, becoming a true partner in battle rather than merely a means of transportation. Thomas felt the stallion stumble slightly as a bullet grazed his left flank, drawing blood but failing to penetrate deeply enough to cause serious damage. The wound only seemed to enrage Devil Shadow further, his ears laid flat against his skull as he wheeled to face Hayes with murder in his dark eyes. The criminal was trying to reload his rifle with hands made clumsy by pain and fear, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate urgency of a man who realized he had seriously underestimated his opponents. The smooth operation he had planned was falling apart under the unexpected resistance of people he had dismissed as helpless civilians. "It's over, Hayes," Thomas said quietly, his revolver centered on the criminal's chest while Devil Shadow stood perfectly still beneath him. The stallion's breathing was elevated from exertion and the graze on his flank, but his attention remained focused on the man who had threatened everything they had built together in Cedar Ridge. Martha Wade emerged from the boarding house with a rifle in her hands, her green eyes blazing with fury as she surveyed the destruction Hayes had brought to her home. Behind her came two other women, both armed and clearly prepared to use their weapons if the situation demanded it. "You made a mistake coming here," Martha said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more threatening than shouted rage. "This town has people worth fighting for, and we don't surrender to cowards who prey on innocent families." Hayes looked around at the faces surrounding him, reading his death in their expressions if he made any aggressive moves. His grand plan to take control of Cedar Ridge had collapsed in the face of organized resistance led by a man whose military skills he had fatally underestimated. The church bell began to ring, not the signal pattern they had arranged, but the steady, triumphant pealing that announced victory and the end of immediate danger. Sheriff Crawford appeared at the end of the street with 3 captured gang members under guard, while Doc Henderson emerged from his office with his medical bag to treat the wounded on both sides. "Your men are dead or captured," Thomas observed, keeping his weapon trained on Hayes while scanning for any remaining threats. "You're wounded and outnumbered. Time to decide whether you want to surrender or die in the street like a rabid dog." For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Hayes considered his options with the calculating mind of a professional criminal who had survived this long by knowing when to fight and when to fold. His gang was broken, his plan had failed, and continuing resistance would only ensure his death without accomplishing anything useful. "I surrender," he said finally, dropping his rifle and raising his hands despite the obvious pain the movement caused his wounded shoulder. "That this isn't over, McKinnon." I've got friends in 3 territories, and they don't forget when someone interferes with their business. Thomas dismounted from Devil's Shadow and approached Hayes with the cautious respect due to any dangerous animal, even one that appeared defeated. His revolver remained ready as he kicked the criminal's rifle away and began searching him for concealed weapons with professional thoroughness. "Your friends are welcome to try," Thomas replied quietly, "but they'll find Cedar Ridge ready for them, and they'll learn the same lesson you did about underestimating people who fight for their homes." Devil's Shadow remained alert throughout the surrender process, his dark eyes fixed on Hayes with an intensity that suggested the Stallion would resume hostilities at the first sign of treachery. The horse had proven himself in battle, transforming from an untamable beast into a true cavalry mount capable of carrying his rider through the chaos of combat. As Sheriff Crawford approached with shackles for the wounded prisoner, Thomas felt the tension that had sustained him through the battle beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the delayed reaction that always followed violent action. Devil's Shadow sensed his rider's emotional state and moved closer, offering the solid comfort of his presence during the difficult transition from combat back to peace. Martha Wade reached them first, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she surveyed the blood on Devil's Shadow's flank and the powder burns on Thomas's coat that spoke to how close they had come to death. Without hesitation, she reached up to touch the Stallion's muzzle, the horse accepting her contact with the same trust he showed his rider. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands moving to check Thomas for wounds with the efficiency of someone who had tended injuries before. "I saw him shooting at you, and when Devil's Shadow stumbled. We're fine," Thomas assured her, though he was already examining the graze on the Stallion's flank with professional concern. "Bullet barely broke the skin. Doc Henderson can clean it up and apply some salve, but it shouldn't cause any lasting problems." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone tense until they recognized Jake Morrison, leading a group of townsmen who had been securing the outlying areas where Hayes might have positioned additional gang members. Their faces showed the grim satisfaction of men who had faced mortal danger and emerged victorious through courage and preparation. "Found 2 more of them trying to steal horses from the Brennan place," Jake reported, his shotgun cradled in his arms like a man who had used it recently. "They won't be bothering anyone again." As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the people of Cedar Ridge gathered in the main street to assess the cost of their victory and begin the long process of rebuilding what had been damaged. Hayes' gang had been defeated, but the battle had left its mark on buildings and people alike. Thomas remained mounted on Devil's Shadow as the townspeople approached, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude, awe, and newfound respect for the quiet stranger who had proven himself their champion when they needed him most. The partnership between man and horse had saved their community, but more than that, it had given them an example of what was possible when trust replaced fear and cooperation overcame conflict. 6 months later, on a morning when spring had painted the Montana Valley in shades of green and gold, Thomas McKinnon stood in the same corral where he had first approached Devil's Shadow with nothing but patience and gentle words. The Stallion now wore a saddle of rich brown leather, hand-tooled by the grateful craftsmen of Cedar Ridge and bearing a silver nameplate that read, "Thomas and Shadow" in flowing script. The new saddle represented more than mere gratitude. It was a symbol of belonging, of acceptance into a community that had once viewed him as nothing more than a passing stranger with questionable judgment about horses. Every detail of its construction spoke to the care and pride the townspeople had invested in honoring the partnership that had saved their lives and their way of life. Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth leather, remembering the morning when everything had seemed impossible and Devil's Shadow had stood untouchable in this same space, consumed by fear and anger that mirrored Thomas's own inner wounds. The transformation in both of them had been gradual but profound. built on foundations of trust that had proven strong enough to support them through the ultimate test of combat. Devil's Shadow approached the fence where a young boy waited with the patient determination that characterized all of his interactions with horses. Billy Hutchins, the same foolish youth whose drunken intrusion had nearly destroyed months of careful progress, now served as Thomas's assistant in training the string of horses that ranchers brought from across the territory. The boy had learned much in the intervening months, not just about horse handling, but about the deeper lessons of patience and respect that formed the foundation of Thomas's methods. Billy's reckless bravado had been replaced by thoughtful observation and genuine understanding of the animals in his care. "Remember what we talked about," Thomas said quietly, watching as Billy extended his hand toward a nervous mare that had arrived just that morning. "Let her come to you. Trust has to be earned, not taken." Billy nodded, his youthful eagerness tempered by hard-won wisdom about the consequences of moving too fast with frightened animals. The mare took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by the calm patience the boy had learned to project instead of the aggressive confidence that had nearly gotten him killed months earlier. Thomas felt a familiar warmth settle in his chest as he watched the interaction, the same satisfaction he'd experienced when Devil's Shadow had first allowed him to touch that magnificent neck. Healing was possible for all wounded creatures, whether horse or human, but it required the kind of patience that most people found difficult to sustain. Martha Wade emerged from the house they now shared, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. The simple gold band on her lefton caught the morning sunlight, a recent addition that represented the culmination of a courtship conducted with the same careful patience Thomas had shown with Devil's Shadow. Their wedding had taken place in the cedar grove that gave the town its name, with Devil's Shadow standing witness alongside the gathered community that had become their extended family. Sheriff Crawford had performed the ceremony, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made promises feel permanent and binding. "Doc Henderson says Mrs. Brennan's colt is doing better," Martha reported, settling beside Thomas on the porch they built to overlook the training corrals. "The treatment you suggested for his leg seems to be working." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Devil's Shadow had moved closer to the fence as if drawn by the sound of their conversation. The stallion had developed an almost proprietary interest in the house and its occupants, often positioning himself where he could observe their daily activities with benevolent WATCHFULNESS. The horse's protective instincts had proven invaluable during the rebuilding period that followed Hayes's defeat. Several times, Devil's Shadow had alerted them to approaching strangers before any human had detected their presence, his acute senses serving as an early warning system for a community that had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. "Jake's talking about expanding the livery stable again," Martha continued, watching Billy work with the nervous mare. "Says word's spreading about your training methods, and ranchers are willing to travel considerable distances to have their horses worked with proper care." The reputation Thomas had built in Cedar Ridge was indeed spreading throughout the territory, carried by satisfied customers who had seen what patient, understanding treatment could accomplish with even the most difficult animals. His methods stood in sharp contrast to the traditional approach of breaking horses through force and intimidation, offering results that lasted because they were built on cooperation rather than fear. Sheriff Crawford appeared at the end of the street, walking with the measured pace of a man who had found peace in his work and his community. The lawman had been instrumental in coordinating the territory's response to Hayes's criminal organization, helping federal marshals track down and arrest the remaining gang members who had scattered after their leader's capture. "Morning, Thomas." "Martha," Crawford called, tipping his hat with the courtesy that had become second nature in a town where everyone knew their neighbors' names and stories. Federal Marshal wants to know if you'd be interested in training horses for the territorial cavalry. Seems your reputation's reached all the way to the territorial capital. Thomas considered the offer while Devil's Shadow moved to stand directly. Behind him, the stallion's presence a solid reminder of how far they had both traveled from the broken creatures they had been when they first encountered each other. The prospect of returning to military work, even in a civilian capacity, carried echoes of a past he had thought himself finished with forever. "Appreciate the offer," Thomas said finally, "but I think we're needed right here. Cedar Ridge has given us everything we could ask for, and there's still work to be done." Crawford nodded with obvious approval, understanding that some men were meant to put down roots rather than continue wandering in search of something they might never find. The sheriff had seen enough drifters pass through Cedar Ridge to recognize the difference between those who were running from something and those who had found what they were looking for. Billy's patient work with the nervous Mar reached a breakthrough moment as the animal finally allowed him to place a gentle hand on her neck, the same gesture that had marked the beginning of trust between Thomas and Devil's Shadow all those months ago. The boy's face lit with genuine joy at the accomplishment, understanding that he had earned something precious through patience rather than force. "She's beautiful," Billy said softly, his voice carrying the kind of reverence that Thomas remembered, feeling during his own early encounters with difficult horses. "What happened to make her so afraid?" "Same thing that happens to all of us sometimes," Thomas replied, watching the Mari respond to Billy's gentle touch with growing confidence. "She learned that the world could hurt her, and she forgot that. It could also be kind. Your job is to help her remember." Martha leaned against Thomas's shoulder, her presence a constant reminder of the domestic happiness he had never expected to find. Again, after losing Sarah and James, the grief for his first family would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him entirely. Cedar Ridge had taught him that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry sorrow alongside Hope Dot in his pocket. The silver watch that had stopped at the moment of his family's death continued its steady ticking, marking time. That moved forward instead of standing still in eternal grief. Thomas had finally wound it again on the morning of his wedding to Martha, accepting that life continued even after devastating loss, and that new chapters could be written without erasing the ones that came before. Devil's Shadow wandered closer to the porch, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere and the desire to be near the humans who had become his herd. The stallion's transformation from untouchable beast to beloved partner remained the town's favorite story, retold with growing embellishment in the saloon and around dinner tables where families gathered to share the day's events. "Think he ever misses the old days?" Martha asked, watching Devil's Shadow investigate a butterfly that had landed on the fence post. "When he was wild and free and didn't have to worry about saddles and riders." Thomas studied the stallion's relaxed posture and alert but peaceful expression, noting the contentment that had replaced the fearful wariness that had once characterized every moment of the horse's existence. Devil's Shadow moved with the easy confidence of an animal who knew he was valued and protected, who trusted that his needs would be met and his well-being considered in every decision. "I think he's learned the difference between being wild and being free," Thomas said quietly. Wild meant being alone and afraid, always watching for the next threat. Free means having choices and knowing that someone cares about the choice you make. The observation carried implications that extended far beyond horse training, touching on the fundamental questions of what it meant to build a life worth living in a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. Thomas had found his own freedom in Cedar Ridge, not through escape from responsibility, but through acceptance of it as the morning progressed toward noon, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of a thriving community. Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. That came from knowing he had found his place in the world. The wooden horse that James had carved still rested in his saddlebags, a reminder of love that transcended death, but it no longer carried the weight of unendurable loss. Devil Shadow lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the eastern trail where dust clouds announced approaching riders. But his posture showed curiosity rather than alarm, and Thomas felt no echo of the old tension that had once accompanied the arrival of strangers in Cedar Ridge. The riders proved to be a rancher and his family, bringing a young stallion that had developed behavioral problems after rough handling by previous trainers. Thomas rose from the porch with the comfortable confidence of a man who had found his calling, while Devil Shadow moved to the fence to observe the newcomers with benevolent interest. "Heard you might be able to help us," the rancher said, dismounting, with the careful movements of someone who had ridden hard to reach Cedar Ridge. "That horse there's got good bloodlines, but he's developed a mean streak that's got us all worried." Thomas approached the troubled stallion with the same patient assessment he had brought to Devil Shadow, reading the signs of fear and confusion that masqueraded as aggression in animals that had lost their trust in human kindness. The horse was younger than Devil Shadow had been, but his eyes held the same mixture of intelligence and wariness that suggested healing was possible with the right approach. "We'll take good care of him," Thomas said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "Some things just need time and understanding to find their way back to what they were meant to be." Devil Shadow whickered softly from his position at the fence, as if offering welcome to another wounded soul who had come seeking the kind of healing that could only be found through patient love and gentle strength. In Cedar Ridge, both broken horses and broken men had learned that redemption was possible for those willing to trust again. The cycle would continue, as it always had and always would, with damaged creatures finding their way to a place where healing was possible and hope could take root in even the most unlikely soil. Thomas McKinnon had found his purpose in helping others discover what he and Devil Shadow had learned together, that the strongest bonds are forged not through force, but through the patient building of trust between souls who recognize their need for each other. And in the corral where it all began, a black stallion stood watch over his expanding family, living proof that even the most broken spirits could learn to soar again when given the chance to heal.